Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service. We welcome you to tonight's Benigna Lecture on Religion and Society, Christians in the Age of Outrage with Dr. Ed Stetzer. My name is Julie Bunchek, and I'm the Program Manager at WIPS. The Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service is a unit of the University of Wisconsin system and was founded in 2007 here in Wausau. Our mission is to address local, state, and national issues by linking public scholarship, civic outreach, and student service to enhance community life throughout Wisconsin. We believe that the strength of American democracy in the 21st century depends on the engagement of citizens and communities in making decisions about issues that matter to them. To this end, WIP's task is to provide resources, information, and ideas to empower the people and communities of Wisconsin. The Benigna Lecture is named after a much-beloved dean of UW-Marathon County, who was also a religious studies professor, as well as a founding father of WIPS. Jim Benigna's vision was to bring nationally acclaimed experts in the field to address topics that often are emotionally charged. Although he died in January 2014, his vision lives on through all of WIP's programs, but most especially through his namesake Religion and Society lecture series. His hope was that people learn from some scholars who have thought deeply and written widely about the connections between religion and society at home and abroad. Tonight's program would not be possible without the hard work of our planning team, including Deb Dorhorst, Matt Froome, John Greenwood, and Eric Giordano. We are grateful to the Wausau West High School staff for their cooperation in hosting the event here, and also to our own theater technician, Chris Burke. We'd like to thank the sponsors for this event: Church Mutual Insurance, the Wisconsin Humanities Council, 89Q Hope is Here, Wisconsin Public Radio, Bremer and Trollope Law Offices, the B.A. and Esther Greenheck Foundation, Mark and Ann Bradley, Chris and Paul Bremer-Mugley, and Linda and Lane Ware. We also want to recognize those of you who have generously contributed to WIPS over the years. Programs like this would not be possible without your support. If after our program tonight you are challenged, inspired, moved, or otherwise enjoyed the event, we encourage you to make a donation to WIPS. We are a self-supporting organization and depend on the generosity of our supporters to survive and thrive. Donation envelopes and information about our organization can be found at the table as you exit the auditorium. Thank you for your consideration. After our speaker concludes his remarks, some of our staff members will be circulating with microphones. If you have a question for him, please raise your hand and someone will bring the microphone to you. It is important that you use a microphone so that others can hear you and also so that your audio is picked up by the video recording. We ask that you accord our guests and each other the courtesy and respect that we all expect from a public forum dedicated to civil discourse. At this time, please check to see that cell phones and electronic devices are silenced. WIPS regularly convenes a group of local clergy to advise us on our religious programs. 1 year ago, we were delighted that Reverend Aaron Widowiski from New Day Christian Church joined that group. I am pleased to now introduce Reverend Aaron to you.
Thank you, Julie. 13 years ago, my wife and I made a transition from corporate work to planting churches, and the first book I read on church planting was written by Dr. Ed Stetzer, and I had the opportunity to meet him at a conference, and I was so excited to tell him that I read his book, and I said the title wrong. And he was gracious to me then, and I've appreciated that. He continues to be gracious, funny, poignant. Dr. Ed Stetzer is the executive director of the Billy Graham Center, and he is a professor at Wheaton College. This is his first time in Wausau, so would you join me in welcoming Dr. Ed Stetzer?
Well, indeed, thank you everybody for having me. You may have met some people named Stetzer in Wausau. Has anyone met someone named Stetzer in Wausau? Raise your hand for a second. You've been arrested because there are 2 police officers in Wausau named Stetzer. And we have My brother's actually a district attorney in North Carolina, so whenever I say to him, meet my brother, well, you've also been arrested. No, of course, it's not the only reason you would meet a police officer, but there's only 311 or so, according to one of those ancestry things, Stetzers in the whole world. And so, but it appears, I've been texting, let me see his name, because at dinner someone connected us. I've been texting Nate Stetzer, and I got to find out if we're somehow, what I can tell, there's not a relation between the two. Our Stetzer branch seems to come from a misspelling at Ellis Island. And so we came over, we were actually Irish, I'm mainly Irish. But it is good to know the Irish are very excited. Usually the Irish don't cheer, but that's good, except at Notre Dame games, but that's another story. So this is a multi-faith crowd here tonight, right? So this is what I'm understanding. Now, I'm Baptist. I hope that won't offend you, because I'm Baptist like Jesus and all the disciples were. But I'd like to find out what you are, just so we know what you are, because there's different groups. So you may know about Baptists, like we don't drink in front of others. There's a lot of things about Baptists you might know. But I'd like to know who else is here first, because I know that I saw at least some Catholics. I met one Catholic. Who were the Catholics among us? Raise your hand, don't be guilty. Just raise your hand high, all right? So that's what I can relate. I grew up Catholic, right? So when I became Baptist, I kept the guilt, so that's good, because we both have that. We have Catholics here. Do we have other Baptists here? Any other Baptists? Okay, few of those, good. Got to be Lutherans, right? How many Lutherans do we have, right? Okay, yeah, whenever there's always 4 Lutherans, there's always a 5th. See, the Baptists don't get that at all. They're like, what are you talking about? I don't understand that. Do we have any Pentecostal charismatics? Go ahead and raise both hands. Anybody? Oh, there's like one guy back there. You're it, man. You're the spirit-filled representation here today. Anybody in a cult or a sect? No. Anybody, and let's see, we got all kinds of denominations here. Well, I met some Alliance people. That's a Protestant denomination. Any Episcopalians? Okay, all right, good deal. One. I became to Christ in the charismatic movement of the Episcopal Church. Another one over there as well. Remember Faith Alive back in the day? That was where I heard the first time was challenged to be a follower of Christ. Any Jewish people here today? No. Muslims? No. So it's more kind of in the Grand Christian tradition. Anybody outside of the Grand Christian tradition? Anybody different? Don't be weird. Don't be afraid, or we just would like to know. No, so it's all kind of, you're either Catholic or Protestant or something within that realm or range. Okay, range. Okay, so I'm going to talk tonight about several things, but I want to kind of begin with something that happened to me 2 years ago. So 2 years ago, I received a card that I was told to carry around in my wallet or on my person at all times. And I was supposed to always have this card with me, and I took it very, very seriously. And so wherever I was, I had this card with me, because there would come a time, it was a secret thing, it was called the Washington Project. And when somebody called me on this number, they would say the words, the Washington Project, and my job was to cancel whatever I was doing, make plans to be at an event. I had to be ready for some media interviews. It'd be global news would be happening, and we'd know before the public know. And so my job was to take the call. They would say the Washington Project. I'd take my card out. I'd follow the instructions. I'd call 5 people, and there were about 75 total people on the list that were in and involved in the Washington Project. And the Washington Project, you see, was important. I had to keep it secret, so you can see I'm really bad at keeping secrets. But it was top secret. I couldn't tell anybody else, because it would involve presidents. Presidents would change their schedules to be here. Airspace would be closed in and around this location where we go. Really, it would be global news. Every news network would lead with what happens when the Washington Project is in play. I was actually in Florida speaking to a Pentecostal group. I like Pentecostal groups. They got all the same rules and regulations as Baptists. They're just happy about them. And so I like that. It's a better fit sometimes. So I was with the Pentecostal group, and that morning I was actually in the shower when the call came. I missed the call, but I looked down and I knew the caller ID. I called back and they said the Washington Project, and so I did what I was supposed to do. I canceled my plans. I went to the hotel, set up a little studio there. You see, the Washington Project was the signal for when Billy Graham died. And so since I hold the Billy Graham Distinguished Chair at Wheaton College, and Billy Graham was a graduate of our school, and I lead the Billy Graham Center. And again, the reason is that Billy Graham, of course, was such a global figure. And so we went to the funeral, and those things indeed did happen. Presidents came. He was in the rotunda, which the last civilian who was in the rotunda, when people are familiar with the phrase lay in state, but this was in the Capitol rotunda. The last civilian afforded that honor was actually Rosa Parks. And so Billy Graham gathered the world. Former presidents, 3 former presidents came. The current president came. President Trump was there at the actual funeral itself. And all this, the whole world kind of shifted. But what's fascinating is the kind of figure that Billy Graham was. One scholar once quipped that you can basically tell if somebody's an evangelical whether or not they like Billy Graham. Because if you go to the right of evangelicalism, some of you are a little shocked that there is anything to the right of evangelicalism. But if you go to the right of evangelicalism, it's what's called fundamentalism. So that's still a thing. We use the term sometimes today pejoratively, but there are actually 13,000 independent fundamental Baptist churches in the U.S. alone. It's about the size of the entire Assemblies of God denomination, or about the size of the ELCA Lutheran Church, which has 11,000 congregations. So independent fundamental Baptists are a pretty significant thing. So they would be to the right of evangelicalism, and they tend not to like Billy Graham. Depending on who you ask, Billy Graham was either asked to leave, left, or got kicked out of Bob Jones University, where he was actually a student, where he started his academics. So Billy Graham, people to the right tend not to like him. Some people to the, and it's hard to, these categories are so difficult, so please, matter of fact, in the introduction she mentioned that we're talking about topics that evoke emotions. If I express something in a way that you don't prefer, can I just ask you to encourage me to this, and you'll love me through it? Because ultimately, I'm going to talk from my perspective. I'm going to try to fairly represent some historical realities, but I'm going to do so in a way you might say, I wish you didn't say this or that. So I talk about people being to the right and maybe to the left of evangelicalism. You're like, well, how do you define right and left? Well, again, just give me the benefit and the grace to kind of listen through and hear what I'm trying to say, even if I don't say it perfectly from your understanding. But so mainline Protestantism, many mainline Protestants were nervous about Billy Graham, not all, but many mainline Protestants were nervous because Billy Graham represented a strand in Protestantism called conversionary Protestantism. And conversionary Protestantism is essential to understand evangelicalism, which many say Billy Graham was certainly the most significant figure in, and I'm writing a book right now on evangelicalism, its present and its future. And some say Billy Graham and a guy named Carl Henry and a few others basically invented evangelicalism. And so Billy Graham dies, and so people say you can define evangelicalism by do you like or dislike Billy Graham. Sometimes people wouldn't like Billy Graham because he called for conversionary Protestantism. Now, so when it came to the funeral, we saw on full display, you probably watched some of it. I actually watched it twice. We were moved by it. What particularly moved me was when he talked about his children. When his children talked about him. And one of the things people called the Billy Graham crusade, the Billy Graham funeral, his last crusade, because millions of people around the world kind of heard what Billy Graham stood for. It was actually interesting. I got an email within about an hour of his death from USA Today and from CNN, both asking me to write articles about Billy Graham. And I was happy to, but I asked them if I could, how explicit could I be about his faith and my faith? And so they said, in this case, go all in. So I wrote an article. Billy Graham was famous. We'd all know he was famous. He met more presidents than anybody in history. He's not like the religious leader who met more presidents than anybody in history. He's the person who met more presidents in all of history. He met President Trump at his birthday party before President Trump was President Trump. But what we found in Billy Graham, he was famous, but what I tried to write in this article is what I wanted you to know about Billy Graham, you could see it on CNN if you're so inclined, was Billy Graham was famous for trying to make someone else more famous. He was actually famous for sharing that men and women needed to respond by grace and through faith to the good news of the gospel itself. So I lead people through a museum at the Billy Graham Center, and at the end of the museum, there's a Billy Graham section. Billy Graham didn't want us to make it all about him. It's a museum of evangelism. And I walk people through this. It goes from, it's of American evangelism. We have a world room at the beginning to just remind people that the church wasn't invented when the Pilgrims came here. But we walk through this American evangelism. Billy Graham didn't want the museum to be about him. So the opening section was an art gallery, and we did different art exhibits. Many of you saw the movie Scorsese's new film. What's his new film about Japan? About the persecution of Christian missionaries in Japan? Silence. So that movie's art exhibit was there because Billy Graham said, I don't want people coming in and seeing pictures of me. But when he died, we stopped listening to him, and now it's all pictures of him. So just remember that. No one decides who lives, who dies, who tells your story. So you got that reference. That's a Hamilton reference. So forgive me if occasional Hamilton references do bubble up from this Baptist. So Graham, when you go through the museum, it comes into this section, and Graham was uniquely concerned that people would respond. Again, that conversionary Protestantism, he was uniquely concerned in the simple message that you would receive. That's language he would use. Now, in other traditions, we use terms differently to receive. So, for example, I attended a Roman Catholic seminary for part of my master's in divinity. I took a few courses there. Two were most interesting, was the course on preaching and the course on Reformation history. Turns out the Catholics have a very different view about how all that thing went. Maybe you heard of a guy nailed something to a door 500 years ago in Germany. They're not as big a fan as him as we might be. Fair enough? All right, fair enough. So we go through, and this conversionary Protestant thing, though, sort of defines Billy Graham's life, but in many ways defines evangelicalism. So I want to talk a little bit about evangelicalism, because that partly undergirds where I'm going with Christians in the age of outrage. But the reality is, to define evangelicalism is a difficult task. And partly because right now, particularly in the age of Trump, it has become even more challenging to define evangelicalism. You've heard the number, 81% of white evangelicals voted for President Trump. Now, I'm not here to take a political position or stand or persuade you. But again, that's now become part of the conversation. And sometimes like for example, there was a hosting recently of a group of evangelical leaders. And those evangelical leaders, someone were secretly recorded, which tells you evangelicals secretly record things. I don't know how I feel about that. But one of the evangelicals secretly recorded and released to the media where President Trump said, he said, so if I don't get reelected, or the midterms don't go our way, you're going to lose everything that you've gained, maybe even through violence. And that made global news. And a friend of mine, Ray Ortland, tweeted and said, no, sir, there's nothing that we have gained that we would lose that is greater than gaining Christ. And but who are evangelicals? And that's part of the question I think we need to ask. So again, most of you don't know me from Adam. But I am an evangelical. And so when I spoke a few years ago, the Army Chief of Chaplains, General Carver, asked me to speak to the gathered chaplains. We have a chaplains training each year for the highest ranking chaplains. And one of the things that he said to me is something that I do consistently when I speak in multi-faith settings, is I don't pretend that I'm something other than I am. Okay, so I too am a conversionary Protestant. I too believe that men and women without Christ are dead in their trespasses and sins and need new life in Christ. Now for some people that bothers them at the core of their being, and I understand that, but I was at the ELCA Lutheran headquarters a few years ago, and we had a gathering, and there were Baha'i leaders. I didn't ask any Baha'i leaders here today. Fun fact, of the 311 Stetzers in the world, one of them is a Baha'i leader who wrote a book on the Baha'i faith. I want to meet all these people. He wrote a book on the Baha'i faith and fly fishing. What a fascinating combination. I mean, how do you have Frank Stetzer? How do you have these two things? So I'm sitting there in this meeting at the ELCA headquarters, and it's for the FACT. It's the Faith Communities Today study project, and it's led by the ELCA Lutheran Research. They have a great research team, but all the key researchers from the Baha'i and from the apostolate, but the Catholics are there, and there's Muslim researchers there, and it's all this mix. And in the course of the conversation, one of the leaders said, and I wrote about this, I wrote a cover story for Christianity Today about this. It's called Proselytization in a Multi-Faith World. Quite the exciting title they picked for my awesome article. I think my mom and I really enjoyed it. I don't know if anyone else actually read it. Anyway, so I was at this, and I started this, so I was at this meeting, and they said, how can we, and I forget who it was, I think it was the Lutheran host, said, so how can we create some resources together that can help all of our congregations thrive and do better. Congregations is a generic term. You can have congregations that are Muslim, they're called mosques. You can have congregations that are Christian, they're called churches. You can have congregations that are Mormons, they're called stakes wards, whatever it may be. And everyone was talking about some ideas, and so I said, and I tried not to look menacing, I said, so I don't really know how to say this, but I'm kind of not desiring to create common resources that people in my church could use, and I was actually sitting next to a Muslim imam. We had become friends, we had lunch together, and that could be used in my friend's mosque. And because for me, as an evangelical, I don't necessarily perceive that we're all kind of moving to the same direction. Matter of fact, just to be honest, I'd like to convert most of you. Thank you for laughing. They did not laugh. They were horrified. Like, who is this country bumpkin? Now, thankfully, I'm from New York City, so I don't have a Southern accent, and so I couldn't be fooled by that. You know, I have 2 doctoral degrees, so they kind of were like, okay, maybe, and they're like real. I didn't like write away for them on a matchbook cover. So I could see the horror, and then my Muslim imam friend says, you know, I kind of agree with him. I'd like all of you to become Muslims. And then someone else said something similar. So here's the thing I want to say at the beginning. Now, this is strange for some people in interfaith conversations. Interfaith conversations are often driven by, let's find the least common denominator where we all agree. And here's what I would say. They can't functionally all be true, right? So Hinduism has 1 million gods. Islam has one God. Christianity has one God in 3 persons. Buddhism, depending upon which sect of Buddhism, there are a few sects of Buddhism that are theistic, most are atheistic. And secular people as well. And so when we begin with the premise that we're all sort of on the same path and on the same way, I think it precludes real, honest conversation. So when I attended a Catholic seminary, I had wonderful conversations. Now again, lest you think I am some some fundamentalist who doesn't. I mean, I wouldn't be here today if I didn't think, technically fundamentalism, I can't even be in the room with you. That's called second-degree separation, so I can't even be in the room with you. But as an evangelical, what does that mean? Well, just a little background for me. So again, raised Catholic, but the Catholic Church was really the church we didn't go to on Sundays. We were Christmas and Easter. People call us today Creasters. And I got to tell you, we weren't really engaged or involved. But I came to Christ in the Episcopal Church. Now, I came to Christ as language that conversionary Protestants say, because conversionary Protestants believe that there's a volitional choice that each individual has to make. And sometimes they create theological constructs around that, something like you'll only hear an evangelical say the age of accountability. Non-evangelicals will never say the age of accountability, because the age of accountability is the point at which we think you need to receive by grace and through faith that Jesus died on the cross for your sins and in your place. Now, don't miss that. So for me, I first heard that message in an Episcopal church of the charismatic variety, and there appear to be very few charismatics in Wisconsin, which is surprising to me. Because charismatics, by the way, are the fastest growing movement and the fastest growing segment of Christianity, growing faster than any time, if you count that movement as a movement, any time in the history of the Christian church. From its beginning, 2,000 years in all of its expression, from 0 before the beginning of the last century, it really takes off of the Azusa Street in this revival, to today, 600 million people call themselves Christians who have been baptized in the Holy Spirit, speak in tongues, believe in things in and around that. So that's where I came to Christ. My father's not a believer. When I say my father's not a Christian, I don't mean he's in another denomination that I don't like. I mean, my father would not identify as a Christian of any denominational tradition. My mother remarried, and they were charismatic Episcopalians, and eventually they migrated to the Orthodox Church, converted to Orthodoxy, and today my stepfather is an Eastern Orthodox priest in the Eastern tradition of the Antiochian Church. So I'm a walking ecumenical movement right here. But evangelicals, so you understand a bit where it come from, tend to be defined by different descriptors. Now, again, it's very important to hear that, for example, sometimes people say, well, evangelicals believe salvation is by grace. No, I mean, pretty much all Catholics believe salvation is by grace. Okay? And mainline Protestants believe salvation is by grace. Mormons believe salvation is by grace. The question is, how do you define that? And so David Bebbington's a British historian, and sort of the most commonly known definition of this is the definition called Bebington's quadrilateral. Try to work that into a conversation with a friend this week, right? How many syllables can you get? Bebington quadrilateral. And Bebington, and again, just an historian observer, he said there are 4 things that define evangelicalism. One is biblicism. Obviously, the word biblicism comes from the word Bible, and fundamentally, all essential spiritual truth can be found in its pages. So that distances it sometimes from other traditions that would be like my stepfather's tradition, that would be built on not just sacred scripture, but also sacred tradition. And so evangelicals are always trying to go back. They have this obsession with the first century church. We just want to be like the first century church. So pretty much for evangelicals, there was Jesus, the apostles, Martin Luther, and them. And that's all we need. Not so helpful, right? So, but biblicism is part of it. There's always an element of what we call restorationism in evangelicalism. We just want to restore to the New Testament church. Why would anybody read the Bible and think that that was a great time? But anyway, that's another story for another day. Second is crucicentrism. Crucicentrism is a focus on the atoning work of Christ. Now again, so would almost everybody in the grand Christian tradition, the great tradition we call that. For evangelicals, it tends to be because they're a type of Protestant. In research today, I'm going to show you some charts in just a minute. In research today, there's 4 big groups that we study. Catholics, we study mainline Protestants. So mainline Protestants would be the Episcopal Church that I mentioned, or Methodists sort of straddle the line, but United Methodists are typically counted as mainline Protestants. There's actually these called these sisters of mainline Protestantism, UCC, United Church of Christ, and lots of others. I don't want to leave anybody out, but I'm not trying to do that by intent. So there's Catholics, mainline Protestants, evangelicals, and then historic African American churches. And that's both, they're in a separate category, though they tend to think, connect in similar ways to how evangelicals think on theological issues, but not identification and political issues. So those are the 4 big groups that are there. So back to evangelicals, right? So all of those groups would believe in crucicentrism, but evangelicals who are Protestants add a word that Catholics don't so much add. So we would say, Catholics would say grace and faith. We would say grace alone and faith alone. And so that's part of the whole where the Reformation came from as well. Now I'm just describing here, I'm not trying to convert any of you yet, and I won't try by the time we're done. But the third thing is conversionism. Now this is something, if you don't understand this part, you can't understand evangelicals. Evangelicals believe that ultimately they have been tasked with the responsibility. It's not just evangelicals who believe that, but I'm saying evangelicals believe they've been tasked with the responsibility to tell everybody that they need to trust and follow Christ. Now this is not an uncontroversial thing. So when I quit my job, I was the vice president of something called Lifeway, which is a Christian resource company. And I took my job here 2 years ago at the Billy Graham Center, and the Washington Post emailed me and asked me, hey, would you write an article about why you quit your job to take this new job? So I'm like, sure, it's kind of a strange request. But I had written a little blog about it, and they wanted me to put it in the paper. So I wrote it, and I put in there, they put when someone writes an article, you should remember that authors don't pick the titles. That'll help you, because sometimes the titles are like, ooh, I didn't want to say that. Well, the title of the article that they put on that was, Call Yourself a Christian? Start Talking About Jesus Christ. A little more aggressive than I would have put it, but not far from what I was saying. Because I just took a job at the Billy Graham Center. I mean, literally, if there's a person who personifies conversionism, it would be Mr. Graham. We call him Mr. Graham in-house. He had a bunch of honorary doctorates, but he, at the end of his life, didn't want to be called Dr. Graham because he didn't earn a doctorate, so we call him Mr. Graham. So I wrote the article, and I pointed out that between Jesus' resurrection and his ascension, there are 4 particular passages. There's more than these 4. But what happens is Jesus teaching, for example, in the Sermon on the Mount. I'm the interim pastor of a church. Some of you, just out of interest, how many of you are clergy? Would you raise your hand for just a second so I can see clergy here? Okay, good. The interim pastor job as clergy is the greatest job in the world. It's like being a grandparent, right? If they give you too much grief, you just give them back because you're the interim. So I'm the interim pastor of a fascinating church. It's called the Moody Church, and it's in downtown Chicago. It's the oldest extant, still existing, as a megachurch. It's the oldest extant megachurch in the whole world. Now, all of you right now are going in your head saying, hey, what about Westminster, and what about, these places often don't have continuing congregations. So I'm here, and so I've been preaching through Moody Church. They preach, it's very, get behind the sacred desk, open the Bible, and preach it. And so I've been walking through Matthew and wonderfully going through the Sermon on the Mount. Okay? So the Sermon on the Mount would be how Jesus calls us to live. And that's throughout here. Jesus talks about the kingdom of God, for example, more than 80 times in we call them the synoptic gospels. They have a similar optic, they have a similar view, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, 80 times in there alone. But between his resurrection and his ascension, his focus becomes very clear. That's that his disciples are supposed to tell people about him. So the most famous one is called the Great Commission. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, right? Baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that Trinitarian formula. Another is John 20:21. As the Father has sent me, so send I you. Another is Luke 24:46 through 48. That repentance and forgiveness of sins we proclaimed in his name to all nations. Another is Acts 1:8. You shall receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. So my article basically boiled down to this. These are Jesus' last earthly words. Now, I do believe that Jesus is still indwelling his people and leading people, but there's last recorded earthly words. And so I simply said in the article that Jesus' last words should be our first priority. Now, not everyone got too excited about that. Actually, to be perfectly honest, they called my old employer and they called my new employer. They doxed my social media. They said, if you're telling people to bother us, we're going to bother you. Which the irony of that, it was not clearly apparent to them. But again, this is one of the things for evangelicals. Now again, remember Roman Catholicism, there's called the new evangelism. That's a whole campaign and a process that's there. We find that mainline Protestants engaging in new, fresh ways to find ways to engage people. Matter of fact, I did a full day training with the United Church of Christ. Fascinating conversation across denominational traditions, even from evangelical to mainline Protestant. So, but it's for biblicism, crucicentrism, conversionism, and activism. The belief the gospel needs to be expressed in effort. In other words, not be earned. There's a distinction between, evangelicals tend to believe the gospel is not what you do, the gospel is what Jesus did. But from what Jesus did, as people who receive new life, we seek to live that out, and that's where we engage for the betterment of society. So, why am I telling you all this? Because I wanted to get some foundation, because what's happening is that in our society, there's not as much an idea. A lot of people sort of think that there's this huge shift going on. There's some huge shifts going on, but I want to kind of explain them just a bit, and I want to ask you to help. Here's how I'm going to ask you to help, okay? I want you to, this whole third, from here over, you are the 30s and the 40s, 1930s and the 1940s. Okay. The middle section. And by the way, is there like a rule about sitting in the back? Is that kind of what you wanted to do? Because that's a Baptist thing, back row Baptist. So I didn't know. I thought it was front row Lutherans. Last row Lutherans, I guess. All right, so if you're in the middle section, you're going to be the 50s and the 60s. And if you're over here, you're today. Now here's why this matters. You guys are feeling up-to-date kind of hipsters of the crowd. Because when I look at you, I think of hipsters. So here's what I want you to answer for me, okay? What percentage of people do you think regularly attended church? Some of you ask, what does regular mean? Say 3 times a month or more. Regularly attended church in the era that you represent, the 30s or the 40s. I need you to shout out a percentage of people who regularly attend church in the 30s and 40s. Shout it out. 85, 80, 70, okay. This, by the way, is how real research done. It's 75%. So we're going to hold that number for just a second, right? So now we come to you, okay? This is the 50s and the 60s. What percentage of people do you think regularly attended church in the 50s and the 60s? 60. Got one guy saying 90, 80. Most of you are like 50 and 60. So we're going to say 55% because this is how real research is done. To be fair, I ran a research company for 10 years. I know how this is done. 75, 55, now today. What percentage of people in America do you think regularly attend church today? Shout out some numbers. I hear 20, 48. Who got 48? Not bad. 20, 25. I'm going to say 25. So here's what we think happened. That from 1930 till now, it kind of looks like this. 75, my head's 55, my other hand is 25. And this is the regular church attendance. Well, let's talk about that. Because actually, there's only one group that's been asking that question, and they started in 1938. It's the Gallup organization. And since 1938, they have been asking that question. And in 1938, the percentage of people who answered the question, did you attend church last week, is the exact same percentage as it is today. Now, people, at this point, you're saying, I don't believe him. Here's why you don't believe me. Something has clearly changed in culture. But I want to talk about some of that, okay? I want to talk about that, and laying out kind of what evangelicals are will help to explain that in some way as we go through this together. I'm going to put up a statistical PowerPoint first, because I want to show you some stats first, and then we're going to walk through a couple things I want you to see. Now, so here's a couple of things that will help to help on this journey, okay? So the Gallup has been asking since 1938. You can Google this. You can verify all my facts on Google. Facts are our friends. I just think we need to talk about them. So you can Google that, follow that along. But there's been a group that's been studying a much more in-depth look at religious practices, and that's the General Social Survey. Now, if any of you took statistics in college, really since the mid-70s, at some point you would have worked with the General Social Survey. It's done every 2 years now by the University of Chicago. Anybody work with that? Just raise your hand if you got any familiarity with that. Okay, several of you do. So it's a real deal. I'm not making it up. So they have a tool, it's called RELTRAD, and it's the widely accepted across the academic disciplines tool. And the RELTRAD is short for religious traditions. And what they do is they ask people questions. They call them up. There's some questions like, do you identify with any denomination? And they say, yes, I'm a Lutheran. Okay, or yes, I'm an Episcopalian, or yes, I'm a Baptist. Well, let's go with the Baptist one for just a second. So yes, I'm a Baptist. Well, what does that mean? Because American Baptists are generally much more progressive and are put in the mainline Protestant camp. Southern Baptists tend to be much more conservative and put in the conservative camp. So they actually ask, well, what kind of Baptist? And using this tool, they survey this huge sample every 2 years, and we actually can tap that sample to see what's going on. So let's take a look here at a couple of those statistics to get a picture of what is actually going on. Because when we see the stats and trends, I think it'll help us to get a picture at a little deeper level of the surface level, because clearly, and I want you to know, I believe this too, clearly something is changing in our culture, and it is becoming much more secular. So what's going on if the people who attend church is not that radically different? Now, to be fair, church attendance peaked in the 50s, and church attendance peaked again in the 80s. But not much off of the baseline. And some people say, I want to go back to a time. I mean, you're all here because you're interested in religion. Some people say, I want to go back to a time when there was, the 50s, when we were more religious. Well, I want you to know, okay, but there's a whole lot of people who don't want to go back to the 50s. People of color, women, others who, in other words, when people had more religious power, they didn't use it particularly well. So I often begin my presentation with this slide, because I like to start on a cheerful note. But then I click the next button to remind people that no researcher anywhere actually believes this. You say, how do you know no real researcher anywhere? Well, there's only about 10 people whose vocation is studying these things. Christian Smith at Notre Dame, Robert Withnow at Princeton, Byron Johnson at ISI, Institute of Study of Religion at Baylor. So we talked all together, had conversations with all of them. So what is really going on? Well, actually, let's take a look. So this is the shift from 1972 of Protestants of all kinds and non-denominational, because almost all non-denominational are Protestants, because it's hard to be a non-denominational Catholic. Not so much a thing, right? There are like independent Lutheran churches, but I want to say to them, you're doing it wrong. But there are non-denominational. In fact, how many of you would right now attend a non-denominational church? Would you raise your hand for a second? Okay, so that's not uncommon. 50 years ago, very few hands would be raised. This is a new phenomenon in our religious context. So what happens is we can take a look. Now, I'm going to show you some numbers, the last data, and I'm going to update you, okay? So if we look here at mainline Protestant. Now, if you're a mainline Protestant, church probably more progressive, So it would be Lutheran, ELCA Lutheran. By the way, let me explain the ELCA thing because it's a little confusing. Because ELCA is not evangelical in the sense that researchers describe it, though the first word in the name is evangelical. So it kind of ruins everybody's party. Every time you have a stats party, everyone's like, oh, the ELCA, because it's confusing. The reason it's evangelical means something different in Germany than it does, and that came over from there, so it means something different. So the groups of Lutherans that are counted in evangelical would be the LCMS, the LCMC, that's the Lutheran Congregations on Mission for Christ, WELS, the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran. Anyone from WELS here? You're from WELS? Do they know you're here? Sorry. Insider Lutheran joke right there that if you're a Lutheran, you thought that's funny. If you're a Baptist, you're like, huh? So WELS actually tend to be kind of the fundamentalists inside Lutheranism. And I was actually asked to speak at a WELS event once and to present some data. They asked, but could you give no religious advice and could you not pray? I said, yeah, but I think it would really be bad. I mean, it would be me with charts for an hour. I want to encourage, but again, that's one of the distinctive lines that WELS, part of their, what you call polity, not policy, but polity. So help me for just a second. So if you're ELCA, if you're Episcopalian, you're Unitarian Universalist, how many of you would be in that category of mainline Protestants? Raise your hand for just a second. Okay, raise them high. Don't be embarrassed. Don't be ashamed. Good? Okay, good. Not a lot of you. Now, if you went back 100 years, it would be most of you would be either Catholic or mainline Protestant. But what's happened is there's been really a hemorrhage of mainline Protestantism. Here's a chart that looks at mainline Protestantism from 1972 till today using the General Social Survey. So in the General Social Survey, what you find is they're asked two categories. Are you, how do you define yourself? That's the top line. So these are people who define themselves as ELCA Lutherans or Episcopalians or Unitarian Universalists or United Church of Christ, whatever it may be. Now when I give bad numbers, people get mad at me like, but listen, math doesn't care about our feelings. This is just math. This is if any mainline Protestant researcher, the best researcher in all of the great Christian tradition is a guy named Kirk Hadaway. He's a United Church of Christ church member and he does the research for the Episcopal Church. He would show you the same chart if it were him. So we see the decline that's there. This is actually evangelical. Now evangelical kind of begins to emerge and begins to show up right around the time when this study takes place. Evangelicals used to call themselves fundamentalists. And it was actually based upon this historical thing, the 5 fundamentals of the faith. And there were things like the virgin birth, the bodily resurrection of Christ, things, and I won't go through all of them for the sake of time. So they used to call themselves fundamentalists, but Billy Graham and some others said, we need kind of a new way. The fundamentalist way is too angry, too separatist. And Billy Graham and others sort of pulled out and carved out what eventually was called neo-evangelicalism or evangelicalism. And we can actually chart that today. That's most Pentecostals, that's Southern Baptists, that's LCMS Lutherans and others. And you can kind of see that it's kind of up and down over the last few years. Let me give you a quiz. I have, and I'm going to show you the next year's data, so it's sort of cheating. But if you look over the last 10 years, and this is 2014 data, which comes out in 2015, and then I have 2016 data, which just came out in 2017, so I just put it together. It hadn't been released yet. I'm going to release it in CNN in 2 weeks. So you're going to get it first. Don't tweet it. But what do you guess? Do you think this goes up or down? You look at the last 10 years. Do you think it goes up or down? It actually does. What's called return to the mean. So the most likely thing after 1 year down is that it'll go up. It's called return to the mean. The Chicago Cubs have been betting on that for a long time, and it finally worked. I moved to Chicago 2 years ago, and I'm like, have the Cubs always been the greatest team in all of baseball? Like, what's going on here? Okay, so mainline, the word main makes you think they're the largest. Well, because it used to be. And actually, in most of our lifetime is when it shifted. So this is regular churchgoers who are evangelical versus regular churchgoers who are mainline. So there's been a huge shift in the last few decades. Now again, this is a chart I published in Washington Post and also did a similar version in CNN. So if you want to find these graphics, they're all available online. And you say, what about young adults? Let's take a look at mainline Protestant young adults. Now, is there anybody here who's between the ages of 18 and 29? Raise your hand. I see you. I see that hand, which is an evangelical thing, by the way. I see that hand. Okay, so several of you. How old are you? 25. I got shoes that are 25. All right, but we're glad that you're here. I remember those days, just sitting around wearing t-shirts to meetings. All right, good enough. What's your name? Josh. That's a good millennial name. Josh. Not Frank or Edward like some of you in this room. It's Josh. Everybody 25 years ago was Josh and Allie, at least in Wisconsin. So Josh, you're 25 years old. These are your peers, right? So where do you go to church, Josh? Downtown Mission Church. Is that downtown Wausau? Okay, good deal, good deal. And is that affiliated with anybody? Non-denominational. You hanging with a network? You got any friends you're hanging with? It's Converge, which, by the way, is a denomination, and you really appreciate it if you would recognize that. I just did the national meeting in Indianapolis, and it was a denominational meeting. I've been to the headquarters, right? I know where it is. It's in Orlando. This is one of those denominations that sold their property in Chicago and Minnesota and moved to Orlando. And they changed their name. It used to be Baptist General Conference, which is the old Swedish Baptist before that. And so I asked, Jerry Shevlin was the president at the time. I said, Jerry, why'd you change so many of your names, right? So he said, you changed the name. Now I'm Southern Baptist, right? So I'm Southern Baptist, which some of you are like, you're Southern Baptist? What are you doing up here? Well, I'll explain. So I'm Southern Baptist, and Billy Graham, by the way, was also Southern Baptist. So I asked Jerry Shevlin, the president of the denomination, all right, I can see dropping general, because that doesn't really mean what it used to mean. It used to mean kind of an Arminian expression when you got lots of churches that aren't Arminian. And conference, what does that even mean? Is that a meeting? But why did you drop the word Baptist? And he said to me, well, there's another Baptist denomination that kind of ruined all of our reputation in America. That would be my people. But listen, don't make fun of my people. If the 50s come back, we're ready to go. We're geared up and prepared for this. So you're 25 years old, you're going to a church that you think is non-denominational, but your pastor and the people that paid money to your pastor to start the church actually thinks it's denominational. Are you the pastor? Okay, good. Did you know it's affiliated with a denomination? Yeah, I get that a lot. Yeah. Denial is not just a river in Egypt, is it? So, is there anybody who's 1829 who's in a mainline Protestant church? Nobody. Okay, so let's talk about that. And this is so the PCUSA, that's Presbyterian Church USA, they're headquartered in Louisville. They just did a great research report looking at their own churches and staff and talked about this. This is actually the numbers when we look at mainline Protestants among young adults. So it's a pretty stunning decline. Now, you can see that the affiliation is very low. It actually ticks up a little bit at the end. And I'll tell you right now, it ticks up again in the new data, identification. But regular church attendance it goes down as well. So what you find is, and this, by the way, is the same question for evangelical affiliation and regular church attendance. You may wonder, everyone always does, like what happened here? What happened here? There was a peak of evangelicals in the 80s, but what happened here and here? Sometimes this is sample size. So we don't know enough. If we see a trend like this, we know something's going on. If we see something like this, we're not sure what that means long term. We're still trying to figure that out. So what does that mean for us? By the way, just so you have this is actually the growth in non-denominational. That's why they're in the denomination and they're not particularly keen on saying it. So non-denominational is the fastest growing category now of all. Now there are some advantages to that. I'm writing a book, comes out in 2 years, on entrepreneurial evangelicalism and the remapping of American Protestantism. Again, Mom and I are going to love that one. But non-denomination as a percentage of evangelicals continues to grow each and each and each and each year. So what does that mean? Well, let me update and show you some of the newer data because I want you to see what's going on today. So this is the most recent data. This is what I've not released yet. And I really would appreciate it if you don't tweet it. But I'm kind of excited. It comes out when the book comes out. The book comes out in 2 weeks. And so they asked me to come up here and do this. And yeah, I can't even buy the book. I can't buy the books. I'm going to buy books here and take them home because I don't know how they got them. So I think that's illegal and there's an explanation that's needed. So, but here's a little bit what's counterintuitive. Because a couple of things are going on. First of all, most of us believe there's been a huge drop in church attendance when actually statistically there's not been. There has been a huge rise in secularism. So you say, hey, how can there not be a huge drop in church attendance when there's been a huge rise in secularism? The answer is most people don't fit in either of those categories. So if you look at kind of 4 quartiles of American culture, 3/4 of Americans say that they're Christian. Now say that they're Christian. And I'm not asking you to pick who can say that or not. But about 3/4 say that they're Christian. That includes Mormons. That includes mainline Protestants. That includes Catholics. That includes evangelicals. That includes everybody who says, I'm a Christian. It's a little less than 3/4, but I can't slice my finger into 10 parts. So it's 3 quartiles. And 25% say they're not Christians. So now that includes secular people. About half of that is secular people. And about half of that is other religions like Muslims and Hindus and Jews and others. Okay, now the fastest growing category is not other religions. As a matter of fact, we don't know what's going to happen with other religions because one of the things that's happened with the rise of the Trump phenomena, accompanied with kind of an anti-migration mentality, and again, I'm just purporting to you what it is. I think everyone on both sides would agree that's the case. If there's an anti-migration, immigration mentality, most of people of other religions actually come through migration. So if you reduce immigration drastically from Asia, the percentage of people stops growing who are in other religions, right? If you reduce it from Central and South America, they identify as Christian. So 3/4, but here's the thing I want you to see. Only about 1/4 of those people kind of plan their lives around their religion. Mormons who, I'm just using these generic descriptions, but Mormons who go to one of the Brigham Youngs, or Mormons who marry another Mormon. But you also know, or Catholics who marry another Catholic, right? And it's important to get married in a Catholic church. But my hairdresser, I know I have a hairdresser, don't mock me. I know I should have a barber, but I have a hairdresser. So she is Catholic, but hasn't been to church in a very long time. So I've been trying to share with her and bring her to a conversation about faith. So she's been living with her boyfriend, and they've recently decided to get married, and they're having a struggle because there are certain rules in her church or parish or Catholic church that she doesn't go to, right? So people like her are not really in that. By the way, I get permission to share that story. They're not really in this 25% who sort of plan their lives around their religion. Now, you know Catholics who do, you know mainline Protestants who do, you know evangelicals who do. Okay, all right, let me give you the backstory of this. So I'm sitting down with a religion reporter for USA Today. She's Jewish. From Long Island, and I'm from Long Island, and she speaks Yiddish, and I want to speak Yiddish. I think that's so cool. Oy vey. But I don't, but I know some of the words because some of my neighbors had them. So I said to her, because I'm an evangelical, and I'm kind of a slice of this. So statistically, I'm about half of this. Evangelicals are about half of the 25%. So about 12.5% of Americans are regularly attending heavily engaged evangelicals. About 1 out of every 8 Americans. It's different in different parts of the country, but as an average. So I said to her, well, we evangelicals, Christians, we just kind of feel kind of put on and marginalized in our culture. And she gave out this wonderful Yiddish word that I'm glad I didn't know what it meant. And this huge belly laugh. She said, you feel marginalized? I'm Jewish. And all of a sudden I was like, yeah, I guess that probably wasn't the right word to use with you. She said, you've had every president since the founding of this country has been a Christian. And I realized at that moment that we were using the words differently. Because I don't know about you, but as an evangelical, I'm not looking at all the occupants of the White House and saying, praise God, we got a Christian in there. But when you're in another faith and they all check Christian on the card, right? So she said, why don't you write an article for USA Today? So I didn't use my hand, I used quartiles. So you've got 25% who say they're not Christian. You've got 25% who say they're Christian and kind of shape their lives around it. Now, I'm not saying who's a Christian, who's not a Christian. This is not a list of those things. But there's this middle part are people like I grew up. Some of them, I call these people, these are non-Christians. I didn't call them that. They call themselves that. I call these people convictional Christians, Catholics and Protestants and others who say, I'm a Christian. It's a conviction that shapes who I marry, shapes my giving pattern. You can look at their checkbook if people had such things anymore. But then there's this middle section. I put them in 2 quartiles, actually. I said, these are congregational Christians. You see them every Christmas and every Easter. All the pictures at Moody Church. Moody Church has 3,750 seats in the heart of downtown Chicago. They're all made of wood. They're all equally uncomfortable. So anytime you want to come and visit, have an uncomfortable seat. But that church is only full on Easter. And let me tell you, all the pictures you see on the front page of the webpage, those are from Easter, not when the church isn't full. So, but that fills up with what I called congregational Christians, and then there's cultural Christians. So there are a whole lot of people, if you had asked many of my family members 20 years ago, are you a Christian? They would say yes, because Christian meant good person. And it doesn't mean something that maybe I might see it mean. So here's the thing that's happening. This is what's important, because this explains a lot of what's going on, right? Is that this middle section here, I want to be careful of my finger motions right here. This middle section here is what we might call nominal Christians. Okay, and that's sometimes a statistical term that has some weighting. But so what's happening, and this is really important, right? Because I've said to you, how come the culture is becoming so much more secular that it feels like people did at church way more 50 years ago than they did today, but they didn't. Here's why. Because the culture was more religiously Christian by consensus, even though it wasn't practicing Christian by consensus. And none of you have lived in an America, and your parents haven't, and your grandparents haven't, your great-grandparents haven't. None of us have lived in an America for 3-4 generations where the majority of people attended church on a regular basis. You have to go to the Second Great Awakening to find that last time. So there are pockets where it does, right? You go to Mississippi, has the highest church attendance rate. New Hampshire has the lowest. There are pockets all around. So what's going on now? Well, let me show you where we are now. So this is the data that's newly out. And so here's what's weird, and it'll surprise some of you. We're actually at the largest rate of, you'll see the number here. No, not this one. This is all adults. Evangelical affiliation, you can see it's up a little bit. It's up a little bit. Because evangelical reputation has taken a big beating in the last few years, and I think will probably continue. Here's actually the young adults. We're at the highest rate of evangelical young adult attendance ever measured on the General Social Service. This is the percentage of Americans who are 18 to 29 who regularly attend an evangelical church. But at the same time, this is what I want you not to miss, but at the same time, okay, right here, this group is becoming more and more secular, while sometimes still keeping the name Christian. So what's happening is there's a cultural forking that's going on. Let me see if I can explain this using a chart that's in Christians in the Age of Outrage. Okay, so this is the chart I want you to see. So, and again, these are not perfect numbers. I'm making a general point. So what's happening here is there used to be kind of a consensus, right? Mainstream culture was Judeo-Christian. Now you can be offended by that, you might not like that, but 50 years ago, if you were running for the school board in one of these towns up and down in Wisconsin, you would probably put that you're a member of a Lutheran church on the flyer. Today, if you put that you're a member of a church on the flyer, you'd lose the election very, very quickly. Whereas 50 years ago, it might have cost you the election if you didn't say, and I'm an active member of so. Some of you can actually remember when politicians would print on flyers that I'm an active member of so-and-so. Now, mind you, there's still a cultural cachet in doing that. So Congress, for example, is the highest group that we count on a major basis that is Christian. Congress is an amazingly Christian organization. Praise God. Because there's a cultural cachet to still say, I'm Christian. But that cultural cachet is shrinking. Now, so go back with me. Now, actually, again, for the sake of the chart, I kind of go back and I use these, remember I have 4 fingers, right? So, but there used to be kind of a consensus over here. So in the 30s, when Hollywood was putting together the Film Standards Board, Hollywood called the Catholic Church and said, give us some ideas. We want to talk to you about how we could create film standards so stuff doesn't get inappropriate in films. Can I assure you today that Hollywood is not calling Catholic Church to ask them anything other than what would really offend you so you'll boycott us and raise our sales? So what happened is there's a shift in the mainstream of culture, right? And so that shift begins to take place over time. That now what's happening kind of in the present, we're beginning to see that it's kind of these really religious people that are sort of out of the mainstream. And this is where some of the frustration begins to go. So this section here, now not all really religious people are going to hold views that are outside of mainstream culture, but most do. And so when you hold views, so take a devout Catholic, right? A devout Catholic who's going to hold certain views that the culture's kind of moved on about issues of morality or issues of life and more. And so if you're a practicing Catholic who holds traditional Catholic beliefs, you used to kind of have these people all on your team. This team kind of stuck together, but now you're kind of more on the outside, and there's a shift that's taking place in culture that I think it's worth us noting. Because remember the big theme that I've been trying to say throughout, right? So back to Billy Graham. So for almost 70 years, Billy Graham has been the living embodiment of religious openness, right? Billy Graham would meet people, visit people, make connections. I mean, the number of things he did were pretty amazing for what he was known for and what he ultimately did. So for example, Gallup does the most admired men. There's the most admired men and most admired women. Graham appeared 61 times. Comparing Queen Elizabeth was on the women's list. She was the second closest overall, right? So Ronald Reagan was close. So nobody gets close to the influence of Billy Graham. So when I was at the funeral, a reporter for the New York Times came up to me and asked me, who's the next Billy Graham? And my answer was, there's nobody that's the next Billy Graham. Because what's happened is, where a religious statesman, in his case, statesperson, a leader of stature, was sort of seen as the embodiment of positive faith, what's happening is there's a shift in culture that's going on, and this middle section here is not holding. Actually, statistically, there's a correlation. It's not a one-to-one correlation, but there's a correlation that the nominals are becoming the nuns. Now, pardon me, Father, I don't mean the nice ladies with hats who can fly. You have to be a certain age to get that reference. 25-year-olds like, what are you talking about? Dude, Nick at Night, right? The flying nun. Anyway, Sally Fields, what is Sally Fields? Sally Fields, right? You like me, you really like, anyway. I have a raging case of attention deficit disorder, so please, squirrel, please forgive me. So Billy Graham is that person, and so people of all stripes would say, I kind of like this person. And again, so looking at this begins to shape this. And so, but what's happening is every year, so 50%, using my little metric that I created, 50% of Americans in this middle category who's calls themselves Christian, but it's not really a life-shaping thing, and 1% less per year of those exist. And the fastest growing group are people who say they're nothing. We call them the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. When they fill out a form, they're not Lutheran, they're not Baptist, they're not Hindu, they're not Jewish, they're not Muslim, they're just nothing, so they're none, they're the nuns. So that is the fastest growing category, and its growth is coming primarily from this people here in the middle. Now, why is that important? Well, a couple of reasons. So Christianity is not dying. Let's go look at the four categories again. Catholicism, Pew has Catholicism declining. Now, mind you, Catholicism has not been without its challenges. Okay, it's been a tough few years. But Catholicism, every study except Pew has Catholicism relatively stable. Now, what happened is people like my family, who are Irish Catholics, were in many ways replaced by Latinos, who then engaged in many. So you see, the Northeast is much less Catholic than it used to be, but Texas is much more Catholic than it used to be. So as a percentage, Catholicism is relatively steady. Historic African American churches are relatively steady. The decline has come in mainline Protestantism, and there's probably a plateau or a tiny bit of growth in evangelicalism, right? So those are the four different quadrants. But all that's taken place in this little 25%. Because what's happening is the culture as a whole is becoming more secular. The nominals are becoming the nuns, right? Here's a close-up on that graph, right? I updated the final year. Remember I told you what's the next year? You're right. But there has been a slight decline in Protestant non-denominationals. It's a weird reason. You have to put non-denominational as a separate category of Protestant, but almost all non-denominational are evangelical Protestants. And so that then leads to the nominals becoming the nuns. We see that shift taking place. Now, why does that matter? Well, because it creates a divide in our culture that Christians, particularly those who are regularly engaged in practicing, which is probably most of you who are here today. I'm guessing you weren't walking by, saw the lights on, were hoping for some sort of coffee after the meeting. I'm guessing that there's some sort of interest in things that are religion and religious. But part of the challenge is that we're in the midst of a tribalism and the challenge over the cultural table, right? So in the vacuum of now the vanishing Judeo-Christian consensus, now I don't use that phrase, politicians used to use that phrase. That's a phrase that in the 80s you would have heard from some politicians. So they don't use that anymore. So I think that's good. So I'm going to seize it, and a lot of us are talking about it in research now. that there's a sense that 75% or 85% of the population 50 years ago were sort of in that Judeo-Christian consensus, this was their team, even though they didn't go, like me growing up on Long Island. I wasn't Catholic, but I didn't like Protestants. And if I was going to go to church, I was going to St. Bernard's. That was my church in Levittown. But I didn't go, but that was still my team. So what's happened over time is that over time we've actually gotten to the place, and Amy Chua talks about this, and where polarization has taken place, right? So there's people who are trying to attain power by pushing others to the margin, and treating people to regain power, seemingly losing ground. And isn't that a lot about our politics right now? Whose rights will be first? What rights will be first? Whites and blacks, Latinos and Asians, men and women, Christians, Jews, Muslims, straight people and gay people, liberals and conservatives all feel their groups are being attacked, bullied, persecuted, discriminated against. Now let me speak to the evangelical thing for just a moment. A lot of that stuff is fake news that we're believing. Stop believing there's a war on Christmas. If the clerk at Walmart doesn't wish you Merry Christmas but says Happy Holidays, snarl back at them and say, Jesus is the reason for the season, and consider it a deal. Or don't. It is not the clerk at Walmart's job to tell you Jesus is the reason for the season. It is your job to tell people that Jesus is the reason for the season. But the division is real, and you can feel it. I can feel it in social media. We have a whole chapter in Christians in the Age of Outrage on the echo chamber. There's a word used in evangelicalism. It's used in some other traditions as well. It's called discipleship, right? Jesus said, make disciples of all nations. Discipleship in many Christian traditions is some ongoing place of deeper spiritual formation. And here's the reality. I don't want you to miss this. Most Christians I know are more discipled by the news channel they watch than the Bible that they read. Now, that's creating polarization. Furthermore, we did this research for Christians in the Age of Outrage, and we found that actually many Christians actually mute people who have differences with them or unfollow them so they can make sure that the only ideas they have are of ideas of their own or people similar to them. And what we know is in an echo chamber, our ideas can actually become more and more and more, dare we say, radicalized over time to the point where we actually begin to see other people as enemies rather than people made in the image of God with whom we disagree. Now, this is partly here. This is actually a survey here, and this is by a research study, Jennings, Nemean, and they tracked over the years, Pew put this out, and they tracked over the years, even between where Republicans and Democrats were, right? You can see here. And this is 2004, where their views overlapped and where they differed, right? And this is 2011, and this is 2014, and this is 2015, and this is 2017. Now, the reality is religion tends to correlate with political party. Matter of fact, let me say some things, don't get mad at me. The more you go to church, the more likely you are to be a Republican statistically. Now, people are like, well, it's just math. Again, math doesn't care about our feelings. The less you go to church, the more likely you are to be a Democrat. Now, what are the exceptions? There's lots of exceptions, particularly the most glaring in the African American community. But here's the reality, is that what's happening is even that is now spilling over into our churches. I'll give you an example. So Moody Church, some of you would have heard of. It's kind of a bastion of evangelism. Anybody been to Moody Church somewhere along? Look how many people have been to Moody Church. It's like a tourist attraction. No, I'm serious. It's on, what's the thing? It's not TripAdvisor, but what's the thing that you rate? We're like a highly rated tourist attraction. One day, right after the election, we came in, and all of a sudden I see the whole floor because Moody Church is a multicultural, multiracial church. We have 70 nations represented there. But the entire floor section, which is maybe 500 people, and they have this big wraparound balcony. It's the largest non-columned amphitheater in Chicago. But it's filled with white people with white hair, all of them. And so I went up and started talking to them, and they all had really deep Southern accents. Now, I lived in the South for a long time. I was fixing to try to learn to fit in, and it never worked. They called me a Yankee, but they had another word that they put before it. So I got back to Chicago as quick as I could. But there was a tour bus company that brought hundreds of people so they could have church Sunday morning at Moody Church, all from South Carolina. And it was And so what happened is, because our church is multicultural, they're all sitting in the balcony. I've got this multicultural balcony looking down on this white senior adult tour group. And but what was interesting is after the election, we actually had a forum at the church. And I asked people. There was a lot of tension. I mean, you might have remembered. The most awkward part was actually the week before the election. There's a famous Protestant song, "It Is Well With My Soul. When peace like a river attendeth my way," and we were singing it, and if you know, some of you are thinking ahead to what the words sound. At some point it comes into there, and we're just singing along. It's the week before the election. Nobody thinks about it, and it says, the last verse it says, "And the trump shall resound." And we're all, who picked that song? Because regardless of your political views, you shouldn't be singing songs about candidates before the elections. And who knew that the Trump would resound? Anyway, but what was fascinating was to see that a multicultural church didn't react the way most evangelicals do. And we had a conversation, people said, "I can't believe," one of African-American men stood up and said, "I can't believe some of you people," I love the fact that you refer to Anglos as you people, "that some of you people voted for that man." And then someone got up and said, "I can't believe you didn't." And there was a clear division that was there. Well, the reality is in most churches, it's not that divided. In most churches, right, we see 81%, for example, of white evangelicals voted for President Trump. And a whole lot of people of color saying, or not just people of color, saying how ultimately that happened. Because what happens is everyone we know, the year before, I had a friend of mine put on Facebook, the election before said, everyone I knew was voting for Mitt Romney. How did Mitt Romney not win? And my response to him on Facebook was, you need to get a broader range of friends. Because if everyone you knew was voting for one candidate, you only know a certain group of people. What's happening, though, is we're getting into these echo chambers, right? Is the study found that consistent conservatives in this study about the echo chambers are rightly kind of tightly clustered around single news source, Fox News, express greater distrust than 24 of 36 news sources measured in the survey. On Facebook are more likely than those in other groups to hear political opinions are in line with their own. And contrast, right, those who are considerably liberal views are less unified in their loyalty, but they're basically CNN, NPR, MSNBC, New York Times, which I believe that people on the right would call the mainstream media. Right, so, but you see this forking between the two, and what's happened in our country has been reflected in our churches, and then we're at the new cultural normal. Now again, please, I'm talking about blocks of people. So during the Q&A, someone's going to say, well, I'm an evangelical, I do that, and I understand that, but I'm talking about blocks of people. That's how research works. Research is not mind reading. I can't say what you did or what you did, but blocks of people there. So what does that mean for us in the future? Well, I think it means a couple of key things I want us to not miss, right? So partly what it means is that the world is changing around us, and it doesn't mean that any one religious group has the kind of the lock on this political expression or that political expression or vice versa. But here's what I want you to see. When part of the outrage that's there is because in the midst of political division comes division between people of faith and people who may not have a faith or may practice their faith differently. Remember I talked about 75-25, okay? And then I expanded it because my friend at the USA Today, you can read that article on USA Today if you're so inclined. But here's what I want you to see. So kind of in the past, the blue team kind of stuck together, right? Again, remember me growing up on Long Island, Irish Catholic household. We were all Irish Catholic, but we were far more Irish than we were Catholic. But don't mess with Catholicism. Don't mess with our church. Don't mess with the priest. That was our team. But that's sort of now faded and changed, although the percentage of people regularly attending Catholic church, now Catholicism has kind of shifted some from Italians and Irish to Latino, but the percentage of people attending church in general has not shifted a lot in decades. But what has shifted is, so these people have been those regular people. What has happened is that this group now thinks more like secular people. And this group thinks more and more that way. And so what we're finding is, if you are a convictionally religious person, many of your views will be out of the mainstream. Now, sometimes they're different views, right? For Catholics and for evangelicals, it might be that they're ardently pro-life. right? So, and others as well. I'm not just saying just those, but those would be things that Catholics and evangelicals might have particularly in common. Some of you might be, really deeply concerned about issues of poverty that pushes against the idea of the American dream, that the goal of every person is to find a nice white picket fence in the suburbs and live there, while the rest of the world you just forget whatever it goes. So as the Judeo-Christian consensus collapses, as what happens, and if we even look towards the future, now listen, I can't tell the future. I'm not a prophet, I'm not the son of a prophet, I work at a non-profit organization. But if you look to the future, and if it continues that 1% a year of nominals aren't there anymore, and 1% more a year are nuns, well, what does that look like? Well, here's what I think it probably looks like. Now, again, I don't know the immigration patterns. Of course, there's a rise of ethno-nationalism that may impact that. It's happening all over. It's happening in Canada. It's happening in Europe. We don't know what that means because we don't know where that ends, right? So, but probably the percentage of people from other religions will probably grow. Right now, it's about 12, 13%. But the biggest group 50 years from now, actually about 30 years from now, if you want to jump that close, will actually be functionally secular people. So the world, the Western world's trajectory is more towards secular and secular views. Now that means, it doesn't mean, there's not a real growth in the number of atheists because most people don't like to identify as atheists. Now, if you're an atheist here, I welcome you. I'm not going to be mean to you or anything else, but most atheists have a very low social approval rating in polls. In other words, people don't like atheists. Now, I like atheists. I'm not saying I think there are many very wonderful, kind people who are atheists, but people are afraid to identify as atheists because it comes with a stigma. Well, I think in 30, 40, 50 years, identifying as a convictional Christian, a devout Catholic, and someone who's living out might have a growing stigma as well. And sometimes that stigma will be that we stand against cultural norms for the cause of Christ. Sometimes that stigma will be because we made dumb decisions about whom we associate with on the way. Now, when we look to the future, though, what does that mean for us? I think that becoming a Christian will become more challenging in our culture for several reasons. Some people will say, I don't want to be identified with some of those people who are Christians because they won't like the way they've related to culture or engaged in politics. Some people will find that there's a cost to identify as a Christian in a secular society. But I don't think the future of the US is like Canada. It's like Europe. Because wars were fought. Literally blood was spilled across Europe over religious wars. We're an outlier. The US is an outlier religiously. Matter of fact, we have some of the highest religious attendance rate in the world. Americans go to church more than Iranians go to mosque as a percentage of attendance. So it's very much an outlier in the rest of the world. So what does that mean? Well, what part of the challenge is, I think, okay, now again, I'm going to come back from an evangelical perspective. So at this point, I'm not saying this applies to you, okay, but I am saying it's applying to me. And I told you, when I talked to those Army chaplains, here's what they told me. They say, we're to the place where we've matured in our relationship with one another. We're not pretending that we all believe the same things. We're not pretending that we all believe God is the same God. But we also have learned to have the maturity to listen to one another. So when a Muslim imam is talking, or a Jewish rabbi is talking, or in your case, this Major General said to me, in your case, as an evangelical Christian, we'd expect you to speak as an evangelical Christian. And it's our job as mature leaders to relate that to our own cultural context, or ask questions, or to disagree. So let me talk to you as an evangelical for just a moment. I think that for evangelicals, they're increasingly going to find themselves marginalized on the edge of society. Here's why. Because their views on issues of morality, views on issues of what's sin and what's not sin, what's right and what's wrong, is going to make that harder. I think political affiliations are going to have long-term repercussions for them as well, for us as well. And so I think ultimately the outrage that's going back and forth on social media, sometimes between Christians and non-Christians, sometimes between types of Christians, sometimes just between Republicans and Democrats who all identify as Christian or don't identify as Christian, I think that's going to get worse and not better in the next few years. So what's the answer? Well, that's part of what I wrote about in Christians in the Age of Outrage. Is I actually looked back historically to someone named Augustine, not the one that you think of. There's another one. The one you think of is really good too. We like him as well, so don't misunderstand. He's the one who said, our hearts are restless, Phillips finds our rest in thee. All of Wheaton College is reading Augustine's Confessions. You can either say Augustine or Augustine. Say it both ways, it confuses people. So the whole campus is reading his I think we're reading City of God. We're just starting City of God. But there's another, he was named Augustine of Canterbury. And I think what he did is a model for what we can do. And I'm encouraging evangelicals to think this way. But Rod Dreher wrote a book called The Benedict Option. He's Orthodox. He's an Orthodox convert like my parents are. And he wrote something similar, but a little more withdrawal from society. I don't want to do that. But Augustine of Canterbury and a guy named Columba and a later missionary named Columban are kind of my heroes. First of all, they're the Irish. You know, Thomas Calder wrote an important book called How the Irish Saved Civilization. And I want you to read that book. If you read anything else, read that book right after you read the Bible. Because the Irish did save civilization. But they saved civilization because first, they had someone named Augustine of Canterbury, and they began a pattern. They came as groups of caring community. And they came along the edge of society, because sometimes they didn't fit in society, but they were known for caring for each other. Think of what Jesus said, oh, how they'll know they're your Christians by your love for one another. They evidence that love for one another. And that love for one another began to love their community. They did kind of what God says in the book of Jeremiah to the people in the exile. He says, listen, you're in the exile. He didn't quite say, listen, you're in the exile. But in saying we're in the exile, he said to them, work, pray for the welfare of the city. For when it prospers, you prosper. And that's what Augustine of Canterbury did. That's what Columba did. That's what Columban did. And they sent out bands. It was monastic in that season. They sent out bands of people who loved one another, who loved their community, and who served in the name of Christ. And people in those communities, whether it was Canterbury or Columba and Columban, went other places to Iona and then sent missionaries out to the mainline. The reason Thomas Caldwell says they saved civilization is they saved the books and brought the books back with them to Europe after the tribes had come in. Tribes named of like Vandals, so you kind of know what they do when their tribe name is Vandals. Kind of wonder which came first, the tribe. So at the end of the day, I think the answer for us is not to pretend that we're a religious majority, but to acknowledge that we're a convictional minority. To hear the words of Jesus in John 20:21. He said, as the Father has sent me, so send I you. We got to move beyond the idea that we'd be the first generation who'd fit into mainstream culture and not have to worry about sometimes where we disagree, and ultimately live as agents of God's mission in the midst of the brokenness by serving others in the name of Jesus, and yes, telling them about Jesus. St. Augustine is St. Francis of Assisi, there's a famous quote that he is credited with saying. It goes like this: preach the gospel at all times, if necessary, use words. Maybe you've seen it on Facebook. There's two problems with it. Number one, he never wrote it. So there's that. Remember the words of Abraham Lincoln, who once said, don't believe all those quotes attributed to me on the internet. And number two, it's really bad theology. St. Francis, who founded a preaching order, would not have said that, and Christians today should show and share the love of Jesus. Thanks for the opportunity to share with you, and we're going to take some questions from you and have a little bit of dialogue, and then we'll wrap up our time together. Okay? So she's already coming towards the microphone. And these two are ready. So if you'll raise your hand if you have a question. I really am not offended or bothered by any question that you will ask. If you disagree, if you ask a leading question, I'm safe. I'm not going to be offended. I recognize people have different views. Oh, we got one right here. Go ahead and stand up, my lord. Sorry. I kind of feel almost guilty about that one, but not so guilty that I wouldn't say it. Is the mic not working for you?
No, it's my, is it working?
Yeah, it's on. You got it. Go ahead.
That's contextualization.
Yeah, there you go.
Like Jesus.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, so as a Christian evangelical, I actually was raised a Unitarian Universalist.
How about that? We have a Unitarian Universalist pastor right there.
Yeah,
you should talk afterwards.
Actually, we had coffee a few days ago.
Oh, how about that? All right, good deal.
So, when dialoguing, it is our conviction as evangelicals that, like you said, the world needs to be converted, and what we believe is, if they are not, they will be tormented forever in hell. That's a pretty weighty thing. So, I think that I would like you to respond to the idea of how we can be friendly, respectful, gentle, but also clear, considering what we believe in that weighty reality, not holding back on that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's a fair question. First, I would say, as you think that, I would hold back. That's not the lead conversation. Hey, I think you're going to hell. Can I tell you how not to go? So I just want to coach you a little bit on that, if you don't mind. I'm kind of an expert in evangelism. That's not the way to go. So this is actually an article I wrote last Easter on CNN. 1 million people read it between Good Friday and Easter. And I tried to explain that. So it's why do your Christian friends keep inviting you to church? It became the most read article on CNN for the whole Easter weekend. And I kind of tried to explain it a little bit. Maybe you wonder why Christians like me won't just leave you alone. I assure you, it's not because we like imposing ourselves on others. In fact, for many of us, it's just the opposite. And I talked about how I invited someone to, on recent Sunday, I stood up at Moody Church, an evangelical church in Chicago, encouraged people to invite their friends. I reminded them, and I go on from there. But also I know that to atheists and adherents of other faiths, it can be confusing to know how to respond to such outreach. Understanding our motivation may help. And so I kind of walked, the fact is churches are gearing up for Easter like pizza places are for the Super Bowl. And I tried to write something that would catch people's attention. And of course, everyone complained about every sentence, so what are you going to do? But look at the last sentence from the bottom, the full. It says, I imagine some react in horror to that statement, thinking, how dare anyone try to convert someone to another religion? Well, here's the reality. That's a very American and very Western idea. Often we need to recognize we need to learn from the two-thirds world. And I got to tell you, most of the world, people have no difficulty. And most Muslim imams that I know, particularly those outside of the West, and there's actually a specific reference in the Quran that teaches them to proselytize. Now, you can't say evangelize. That's a uniquely Christian word because it has a root this. But Christians proselytize. It's called evangelism. Muslims also proselytize. But not all faiths are missionary faiths, right? So some faiths are not missionary faiths. They don't try to convert others. Well, our founder told us to. And so that's kind of what I walk through in this article. And I said, it makes sense. The world of spirituality has been Oprahified. In a culture that says it's fine to believe what you want as long as you don't try to convince anyone to believe differently. It works great, if it not for one reality, the words of Jesus. So when I say, I know you love the words of Jesus like do unto others, and Jesus had lots of great teachings beyond that. But Christians call these commands commissions. So imagine writing about the Great Commission in CNN. It was kind of fun. And they include go and make disciples of all nations, right? These are the last earthly words, similar to what I said in the Washington Post. Right, so I call it the P word, the idea of proselytize and more. And so what I would say is what Jen Penn Jillette said. He's a well-known atheist, right? This is how I would answer that question. So Penn Jillette, well-known atheist, he shoots a video. And he actually has, there's a show on paid television that I can't pronounce the name of it. That's just a one-word, BS is the name of the show. And so he believes that religion is BS. But he says, I don't respect people who don't proselytize. If you believe there's a heaven and a hell, and you think, well, it's not really worth telling them that because it would make it socially awkward, how much do you have to hate somebody not to proselytize? So that's some pretty strong language. So when people begin to understand that's part of what our founder, Jesus, told us to do, that we ultimately want them to receive eternal life, that's the motivation. Now again, the tricky thing is that not all people who call themselves Christian have the same belief about some of those things. But that's how, as evangelicals, when I teach someone evangelism, I teach them to say, have that conversation. I'm telling you this because this is so essential to me. So when I shared the gospel with my father for the first time, I was a new believer, just came to Christ. I came home. I didn't know. All I remember is what the person said. And he asked me to be saved. The speaker said, are you saved? So I came into my dad. And I said, Dad, are you saved? And he said, saved from what? And I said, I don't know, but I just was, and you really need to be. So over time, I wanted to articulate that more clearly. And so I think the way we articulate it clearly helps people to see that it's from a place of love that we come, but not everyone's going to receive it that way. It's just not going to happen. Good, somebody else. Yes, right here. Or wherever, I don't know. Hands are up there as well. That guy right back there, if you want to work over with the microphone. Yes, sir.
So, given what you talked about tonight, how do I do Thanksgiving this year?
Yeah?
Yeah, because honestly, that's what it boils down to for a lot of us, is we sit down at a table with people we love.
Yeah.
And we have unloving conversations.
Yeah.
Especially in this political world right now
Yeah, totally.
that we live in.
Yeah.
So how do we do that? We can do it on social media, we can talk about that, but how do we actually do it around our table with the people that we love and not alienate them, but to love them? I mean, it's similar to his question, but it really has to do with maybe the political, religious
And what's happened in a way that hasn't happened before is because evangelicals have been uniquely identified with President Trump in a way they haven't been identified with past administrations. There's a new book out by John Fia on my desk. It's called Believe Me. It talks about how evangelicals were wooed by President Trump. And again, it's not a secret. If you read the Washington Post, I was asked to be on the advisory council. That some of you see those evangelical leaders on Trump's advisory council, and I declined because I was concerned about this. So for me, when I share the faith, it's not in a political sense. And I think that's super unhelpful. Jesus is not coming back on Air Force One, and he's not going to be riding on a donkey or an elephant when he does. And so for me, I want to distance myself from that. And the way I do that is, I actually have if you read Christianity Today, it's an evangelical magazine, it comes out in 2 weeks. We have a whole data set. I did 3,000 interviews for a research project to kind of say that, that 81% is white evangelicals, but there are a lot of people who believe like white evangelicals who voted differently. It's not a lockstep thing. But for me, it has to do with building relationships with people and recognizing that we can disagree. And one of the greatest things, maybe the opposite of love is not hate, maybe the opposite of love is disgust. There are a lot of people who have disgust for people right now. They have disgust for evangelical Christians, or maybe another group has disgust for people who are LGBT. Maybe another group had disgust for people who voted for somebody. And what I would say is I don't see in Jesus' teachings, well, let's go even broader than that. I don't see in the Hebrew scriptures, I don't see in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Furthermore, I don't see it in a whole lot of religious traditions. I see one theme that's in many, but certainly in the Judeo-Christian tradition, is that men and women are made in the image of God. So when I sit across the table from somebody who radically disagrees with me, what I see in him or her is someone made in the image of God, worthy of dignity and respect. So in Christians in the Age of Outrage, I'm writing for Christians, and I say, here's some paths for them. I say, let's learn what winsome love is. Second, what does it mean to be an ambassador of the kingdom? So Paul writes in 2 Corinthians, Paul's an apostle, he writes in 2 Corinthians that we are ambassadors for Christ. He's actually talking about himself, but I apply it to us. So what does it look like to be an ambassador? If you're representing Jesus, would it really look like that, the way you're engaging on social media? And I talk about something called digital discipleship. See, what's happened is I think social media, I actually compare social media to lead. So lead, everybody, my home in New York City had lead pipes because it was malleable, it was easy to use, it was cheap. Everything was lead pipes, and we didn't know it was killing us all. I think social media is the lead pipes that 10 years from now we're going to see, I can't believe we allowed this to cause so much damage in our society. Now, mind you, I have 1 million followers on all the different social media outlets together. So I'm like, the hypocrite for saying these things, right? On all our different accounts in our work. But what I would say is I seek to use it to build bridges, not to burn them. And so how do we have, but here's the reality. Are you a Christian tradition person? Okay. Evangelical, mainline Protestant, Catholic, what? Anglican, ACNA, Episcopal, which? ACNA, okay, I speak Anglican. You gotta learn a lot of letters to speak Anglican. So he's canonically resident in the ACNA. But what I would say in the Christian tradition, you have to ask the question, what ultimately is more important? Me attaining and keeping cultural influence and power, or me representing Jesus and his kingdom well? And I think the latter. But I think what happens is Christians don't do well when they get access to power. Historically, haven't done well. I mean, again, go back to the 50s. You want to go back to the 50s when was more religious? Why didn't people, when there was more religious influence, why weren't issues of racial injustice addressed then? As a matter of fact, my denomination, too many people in my denomination were on the wrong side of the hoses in Birmingham, Alabama. So I can't look back to history and say, well, I always got this right. But I can, kind of in an evangelical tradition, as ACNA, one of the 3 streams of ACNA would be evangelical. In that evangelical tradition, I would say that restorationist view, what it would look like to go back to the way Jesus lived, or go back to the way the early church did. Rodney Stark in his book, Cities of God, how Christianity became an urban religion and conquered Rome. He writes about the late second, early third century when plagues swept through the empire. And as the plagues swept through the empire, the Christians, well, they didn't do what everyone else did. They didn't burn the bridges into their communities. They actually cared for their own sick and dead. Later on, there was an emperor by the name of Julian the Apostate. And Julian the Apostate, history is written by the winners, by the way. And so you end up being called Julian the Apostate. But he tried to stop the advance of Christianity. And here's what he said when he was railing against the Christians. He said, these impious Galileans, that's what he called the Christians, these impious Galileans not only care for their own sick and feed their own people, but they care for ours as well. And apocryphally, it's not true, probably. At the end of his life, he raised his hand and said, "You have one Galilean." That's probably not true, but the first part is. So what I would say is, I think we find a different way. I'm calling for Christians to walk more the way of Jesus, showing and sharing the love of Jesus in the midst of a broken and hurting world. And that's not the majority opinion right now. But I think we've got to disciple ourselves into that. We've got to address this issue of social media that 10 years ago did not exist, and I've never heard someone preach a sermon or teach a Bible study on social media. And yet some people spend their whole day, even at work, with Facebook on the background, interacting with ways that don't glorify Christ. So I think ultimately it's a submission to the lordship of Christ and living as Jesus would have us to live in this time and day. Someone else. Right here, yeah.
Yes, you were talking about Christians and Christianity moving towards secular thoughts and secular ways.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that it's possible that how man has taken the Bible and started tailoring it through different translations and all that thing to tailor to serve man or to appease man in their opinions and their ways of life, other than glorifying God and learning about God?
Okay, so Bible translations, I don't think I think that. I would say that every Bible translation I know still translates Luke 9 and other places as, deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me. And I would say that, there's a range of acceptable Protestant translations from the NIV to the CSB to the RSV or the NRSV. The New American Bible tends to be more Catholic translation. Some groups, like Jehovah's Witnesses, sometimes have their own translation, but that's it's on the margins. So I would say, by and large, was it Mark Twain? Maybe it wasn't Mark Twain, but everyone quotes Mark Twain with this. It's not the parts of the Bible that I don't understand that bother me. It's the parts of the Bible that I do understand that bother me. And I would say that most Bible's translation, even the NLT, which is probably the easiest to read, it's not the easiest to live. So I still think it's pretty clear that no, this is a faith of denying ourselves, following him, and living differently in the midst of a cultural storm. Time for any more? One more right here. Oh, I got nowhere to be, so whatever you want to do. If you need to go out and grab a quick smoke and come back, that's fine with me. Whatever you guys want to do. Go ahead.
I'm a kind of a statistics geek, and I also have an uncontrolled case of ADD, which is totally rampant. So I was tracking with you just like this.
We were like, we're gonna get together and just lose our focus.
We are so
Yeah.
Without going into any detail, I have had two very unusual careers, one in the military and one as a civilian. My question involves the military.
Yeah.
I found it very interesting that you referenced Congress, which would be a splinter group in this big picture of your research. My question involves the military. Anecdotally, my observation has been that there are more convictional Christians, percentage-wise, in the military than there are anywhere else that I've ever been. Now, is that just wishful thinking, or do you have any data on it or any observations? Because I'm curious to know.
Yeah. I don't know statistically. Harvey Weinstein, who leads the Freedom from Religion Foundation, has filed some lawsuits talking about the disproportionate representation of religious people in military leadership and military programming, basically, particularly evangelicals. So you wouldn't be the only person to have made that observation. And that goes back a long time. There are no atheists in foxholes. You may have heard that as well. But I would say when I spoke to the Army Chief of Chaplains, I've trained the Army Chief of Chaplains, Navy chaplains, Coast Guard chaplains, others. They say that what they have is more people who don't know what they believe than people who have a distinct faith. And I really appreciate, if you want to talk about a multi-faith environment, I really appreciate how they can serve alongside one another, yet at the same time have very distinct beliefs that they know are in contradiction with one another. They're not looking to say, let's find the thing we believe in common and say we just all agree, because we don't. But here's one thing we agree on. We want the world to be a better place. We want to minister to our soldiers. So, but I do think that you're probably right, but it's difficult for me because I ran a research company for 10 years. I'm always hesitant to say something's probably true. 87% of statistics are made up on the spot. So let me just say I don't know for sure. All right, thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you, and I appreciate that.